Hey there, Blazer fans, and welcome to episode 26 of The Dragon's Den, a podcast for those that bleed green and gold. This week's guest has been around UAB athletics in many ways over the years and has some fantastic stories to tell. This man is Mr. Tim Stevens. I really think this episode is going to be great for those that have known Tim for many years and those who haven't met him. Tim goes into great detail about his time in the UAB athletics SID office, his work with several high-profile media outlets across the country, and his work with UAB advocate Timothy Alexander and the return of UAB football. We have a lot to get to, so I hope you enjoy the episode. Before we dive in, be sure to stick around for Blazer birthday shoutouts and football games played in Blazer history from August 21st through September 3rd in another This Week in Blazer History segment. Thanks for listening. All right, Blazer fans, I've got my guest here for episode 26 of The Dragon's Den, a man who's definitely been around UAB athletics for a long time and been around the UAB community and the city of Birmingham for a long time as well. Mr. Tim Stevens. Tim, how you doing today?
I'm doing great. I appreciate you having me on and excited to talk to Blazer Nation here today.
It's definitely an honor. So you've been around the block, like I said, in the UAB community for a long time, but for those that may not know you, maybe give a little bit of background into your life, where are you from and what brought you to UAB?
Yeah, sure. I grew up in Alabama, town in Northeast Alabama called Fort Payne, up there between Gadsden and Chattanooga in the Lookout Mountain area, and also spent some time down in South Alabama in community college, and came to UAB in 1991. Was actually recruited to UAB by Gene Bartow to work in athletics, and that's a story I'm excited to tell today how that happened. But I've worked in the SID office, spent some time as radio analyst for UAB football. A really exciting time to be at UAB in the early 90s with the establishment of football and basketball and the other sports changing conferences, and Gene Bartow at the end of his career doing some things that impact UAB athletics even today. But then I moved on. I gave up my job at UAB to make $25 a story at the Birmingham Post-Herald because I really wanted to be a sports journalist, and eventually worked my way all the way up to sports editor of the Post-Herald and talk show host here in Birmingham, then on to Florida at the Orlando Sentinel and the South Florida Sun Sentinel, and finally CBSSports.com. So I spent a 25 plus years in sports journalism before coming back to Alabama, which just happened to coincide with the return. So came back in 17 and have been doing business here in Birmingham, and have really gotten to be back around the UAB program again at what again is a really impactful, exciting, dynamic time.
Yeah, definitely. So like you said, you got to UAB in 1991. You were immediately involved in multiple aspects of the university, including starting out in the SID office, like you said, and you worked for the Kaleidoscope campus newspaper. I'm also a former Kaleidoscope worker. So talk about your roles that you had in both.
Well, first, I'd love to share how I ended up at UAB. And really, the reason that you and I are on this podcast today is because I left dirty socks on the floor. And my mother, was fussing at me that I needed to get my life together and get on down to college. She was tired of me living in her place. And so she kicked me out, so to speak. Not really, but sort of. And I ended up in South Alabama and got lost one day and came out at this community college, Faulkner State Community College today. It's called Coastal Alabama down in Bay Minette. And I happened to walk in. I'd been a newspaper reporter during that time, freelancing and covering high school sports at various times. And so I walked in with a resume and walked out with a scholarship. All right. And to be, editor of the school paper at this community college. And as it turned out, as fate would have it, Will, you just don't know about these things. My basketball career ended at Faulkner after about 2 practices when I figured out my path to the NBA would be writing about it, not shooting. But my suite mate in the dorm ended up being the #1 junior college recruit in America. Now, nobody knew this when he arrived, and certainly I didn't know this when I was sharing a dorm with him. But that year, my last year at Faulkner, Leonard White was recruited by basically every major program in America at that time. And so our dorm would be filled with coaches like Wimp Sanderson and Jim Valvano and Jerry Tarkanian from the Running Rebels of UNLV. And, even Bob Knight, who didn't really like to recruit JUCOs, but he wanted to recruit Leonard White. And I got to know coaches like a young Leonard Hamilton, who's now a Hall of Famer at Florida State, or a young John Brady, who would go on to coach at Samford and then LSU. And through that process, I met a UAB assistant coach named Joe Evans. And Joe was down practically living in my dorm and, down there recruiting Leonard. And Leonard was very seriously considering UAB. And through that process, it just so happened that Coach Gene Bartow, came down to Bay Minette to visit Leonard. And I wanted to interview Coach Bartow for the school paper and for the Mobile Register, because of course at that time UAB and South Alabama were in the same conference. They were in the Sun Belt. Just we're heading into March, and I thought, hey, I can sell an article here. So I go and I interview Coach Bartow, and when we're done, he said, that was a really impressive interview. What are you going to do when you leave here? And I said, well, Coach, I'm deciding now what colleges that I'm looking at, and UAB is one of those. My mother's actually moving to Birmingham, and I'm very interested in UAB. And he said, UAB could use more fine young men like you. Those were his exact words. And I didn't give it another thought, Will. So I wrote my article, turned it in. Leonard, of course, is going on and being recruited by everybody. I think the night that Coach Bartow was there, he had 52 points and 24 rebounds or something crazy like that, right? And a couple of weeks later, I get a letter, and I opened that letter, and they said, Tim, you got mail. They hand me the letter, and they said, and it's a handwritten note and it says, Dear Tim, thank you for the kind article. UAB could use more fine young men like you. B. Gene Bartow. And so at that point, I'm a Blazer. He doesn't have to do anything, right? I'm going to be a Blazer. I'm going there. Well, a couple of weeks after that, the phone rings in the newspaper advisor's office. And they said, Tim, you got a call. And I walk in and I answer the phone. Hello. And he goes, Tim, this is Gene Bartow. Leonard's coming up on his recruiting visit. We're sending a plane down to pick him up. Would you like to come up on his visit with it? And I was like, Coach, Leonard's his own man. I'm not going to be able to influence him in any way. And I really don't want to be part of his recruiting. But is it okay if I just drive up and visit my mom and come see campus? He's like, sure. So I come up that weekend, and it was like I was a 5-star recruit. They took us to eat at Michael's. We had steak and lobster. And this was a big time recruiting visit. Leonard was there. A player that Blazer fans are very, very familiar with, pretty legendary player, Robert Shannon, was there on that recruiting visit. A couple of other people, they were there, and I was, blown away. Murray Bartow and Joe Evans show me around campus, and we get to Sunday, and they've already had me sit down with my academic advisor, and they have my entire schedule mapped out, and they treated me like a basketball player, and I expected, okay, maybe this is going to lead to like a work study job. So Coach Bartow had said, come visit me Sunday, and, why don't you bring your mother with you? So my mother came over to campus, and we toured, and we go into Coach Bartow's campus. And of course, I was nervous as could be. My dad's a basketball coach. I knew who Gene Bartow was. I'm sitting there in his couch, and there's all these pictures from the Final Four and the Final Eight, and, National Coach of the Year plaque. And I'm sitting down, and, I'm thinking maybe I'll get like a $5 an hour work study job. And he's like, Tim, we'll give you your books, your tuition, your fees. We'll put you up in an apartment, and we'll give you a monthly stipend to help you pay your bills. Would that be enough to get you to come to UAB? And I'm like, yeah. Right. So that's how I ended up at UAB. All right. Of course, I was incredibly excited about it. And I graduated from Faulkner State, now Coastal Alabama. I think it was June 7, 1991. I drove that night after the graduation commencement. I slept in my car in Birmingham, and I went to the dorms the next morning, moved in, and started classes that afternoon. Wow. And during that time, UAB this was 1991. That was the first fall for NCAA football. So right away, we're jumping into football season. And of course, I was a student assistant in there, but I did things like, write the daily practice reports. And, I was a photographer, so I did a lot of the photography. In fact, a lot of the old UAB photos that fans see now on social media from that era, I took them. They were a lot of, I'll see a lot of my old photos still floating around today, but that was just an incredibly exciting time. And well, one other thing I'll tell you about that story, just to think about this as a college student coming to Birmingham, and the front row seat that I got, how to be incredibly blessed to be this, almost a front row seat to history happening. I think it was the second week I was on campus, and I still barely knew my way off campus. I didn't know the Birmingham roads. They hand me the keys to a van, and they said, Tim, we want you to go to the airport. You're going to shuttle people coming from the airport to the Redmont. It was the inaugural Great Midwest Conference summer meetings. The conference had just been formed. And so literally on my first trip, and I had no idea where I was going, I barely knew the roads. And I go to the airport and I pick up, these were the first four people that I picked up. Person you probably heard of named Bob Huggins. A person you've probably heard of named Kevin O'Neill, who was the head basketball coach at Marquette. Mm-hmm. And a guy that I know everybody's heard of named Michael Slive, the commissioner of the Great Midwest Conference, who would go on to be the great commissioner of the Southeastern Conference, and who, until the last day I saw him, never failed to remind me that I was once his chauffeur from the airport. He always remembered those early days. And he always made it a point to, reference some conversation from back that time. I just really loved that about it. But, that's being thrown right into the fire, because I literally almost got us lost coming back from the hotel. It's funny.
That's some great stories, Tim, man. It's incredible the amount of people that you've met back then that, even back then, they might not have seemed like much. Like, you just mentioned Leonard Hamilton at Florida State, like probably back then was, maybe just starting out in coaching and stuff. But I mean, my goodness, that's quite a rap sheet of guys that are coaches and people that you've met. That's incredible.
That's the way it is in this industry, Will. I mean, and I've gone on to journalism, right? And I've done a lot of mentoring to young journalists. And I was president of the Associated Press Sports Editors, for example. And of course, interns and things over the years that I would work with. And I would always tell them, it's a small world we live in, and you never know who knows whom, and you never know who somebody will become.
Exactly.
And that is especially true in sports, where, that GA that you're talking to today in 30 years may be Nick Saban.
Yep.
Right. Or, that young reporter that doesn't have a clue what they're doing out at your practice, and you have to fuss at for, going to the wrong place. In 25 years, they're anchoring Sports Center. You just, you just never know.
Yeah.
And because of that, I really always tried to pick up on something that I learned from Coach Bartow. It really became part of my leadership style over time. And I think about this a lot. Coach Bartow was Ted Lasso before there was a Ted Lasso. And I don't know if people have ever watched that show. It's a great show on, Apple right now. He's a fish out of water American football coach. He's off coaching European soccer, but it's really not a sports show. It's a leadership show. And something that Coach Bartow didn't matter if you were the janitor or his number one assistant coach or the university president. Coach Bartow treated you like you were important, and your role mattered, and you mattered. And that is one reason that Coach Bartow had such intense loyalty, is he made everybody feel important in their role. And that is a quality that you see today vividly with Bill Clark, for example, who is, if you've spent any time around him, and I know you have, is the most intense competitor you could ever imagine. Mm-hmm. And yet everybody in his organization feels important, and they feel like they are personally important to him. And that is why they run through walls for him. Yeah. Right. And everybody knows their role, and they know their contribution is valuable, whether it is to be an All-American quarterback, to call the plays, or make sure the trash is picked up off the practice field. That was a quality that Gene Bartow brought to his organization every single day, and it's why people loved him.
Well, you came to UAB at a very important time, like you mentioned, in the football program's history. The program was in its first year at the Division III level, and you were the team photographer, as you mentioned, and you were on the sidelines for UAB's very first Division III game and the first win in program history over Washington and Lee. What do you remember from those games?
Oh wow, those were so fun. First off, you know, UAB football in those early days under Coach Hillier was like a combination of the Bad News Bears meets Rocky. You know what I mean? There were all these crazy hurdles and crazy things that would happen, and there were all these characters meshed together in what was truly an ultimate underdog story. Because everybody who was part of it, from the very first day, knew that they were part of something bigger and that they were there specifically to help it get there. And so you had this incredible coaching staff that Coach Hillier put together of people like Dieter Brock and Joe Cribbs and a wild man of a defensive line coach named Richard Shin, who had played for Coach Bryant at Alabama and was just a 6'6" wild man. And his players like Josh Evans were just absolute beasts. They were so good. Josh Evans actually was the very first UAB football player that I ever met. Think about that. The very first UAB football player that I ever met spent 10 years in the NFL, and he came there on no scholarship. Right. So that's just incredible. So, the very first game we go to over to Millsaps, Mississippi, and it was about 107 degrees, it felt like, and it was incredibly hot. Of course, we lost, but I'll never forget. We picked up a copy of the Jackson Clarion Ledger that day, and they had a little game preview in there for the Millsaps Majors against UAB. And I'll never forget the lead, because the lead didn't reference UAB. The lead referenced Florida State and Miami. And it said, if someday this program becomes a Florida State, you'll know it, you'll remember it started here. Right? That was what the lead said. That already this newspaper from out of state envisioned UAB football growing on to be something far bigger than it was. Okay. So, we get there, they lose that game. They lose the next week in their home opener, but then they go up to Washington and Lee. And there are a couple crazy things that happened on that trip. First, I remember driving up there. We were on a bus, and it was a long drive, and I think we cut the trip in half, stopping off in Tennessee. And I'll never forget, I think it was Johnson City, Tennessee, and we pull in the buses, and it said, there was a sign on the hotel, it was a Howard Johnson, I think, and it said, "Welcome, University of Alabama." And so everybody was like, what? So we pull out of the buses and we're unloading the buses, and all of a sudden we're all there outside, and we hear these pings, ping, 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 and then you hear ouch, ouch. And there were some kids off in the bushes who thought we were the Crimson Tide, and they were shooting us with BB guns. They were Tennessee Vol fans.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. So they were spraying us with their little BB guns because they were Vols, and they thought sure we were the Crimson Tide. And it was just hilarious. But, we go on up to there. And Washington Lee's a private university up there in Virginia. And I'll never forget this. There was a celebrity in the crowd because his son was going to college there. It's Oliver North from the Iran-Contra scandals. Oliver North. He was there watching the game. Washington Lee's quarterback was actually a kid from Mountain Brook. So there were people on that team. There were a couple players from Birmingham who were on this Washington Lee team. But we go up there, and I remember UAB had a defensive end named Rod Foster, who set a school record that day with 4 sacks that still stands to this day. It was a back and forth game. Pat Green, who I know was the all-time leading rusher at UAB until Spencer Brown broke it last year. Pat Green had a monster game, had an interception late, and at the end, Coach Hillier gets a victory ride, and I happened to be on the field and took that picture. And so until the place closed down in Fat Sam's over there on campus, there was a big picture of Coach Hillier's first victory ride, and I took that picture. So I was pretty cool of that.
That's awesome. So you mentioned him a few times just now, but what was your relationship like with the program's first football head coach, Dr. Jim Hillier?
Well, I loved Coach Hillier, and the job he did at UAB really is, I think, a little bit underappreciated. he had everything in the world against him. He was, he assembled all this great staff, but those people weren't, making a ton of money. They were doing this because they loved it and they wanted to be part of something bigger. Right. And, if you went through that staff, they were, a lot of them played in the NFL or played in the USFL or been on the Stallions staff in the USFL or, played for the Stallions or whatever. These were big time. I'll tell you right now, sitting down in a coach's office and watching Dieter Brock break down film was something you wouldn't forget if you love football. I mean, like Dieter Brock was a genius on the offensive side. And then Coach Hillier, one of the things that I did in the SID office, and to be clear, I was not the SID of football. I helped with football, right? I was a student assistant, but one of my duties was to write the practice reports every day that would get sent to the Post Herald News. So every afternoon I'd interview Coach Hillier. And then after every game, I would go interview Coach Hillier because I would run the quotes that would go into the Associated Press story, And so I talked to him almost every day and spent time around him. He was intense. He really brought out talents in people that they didn't know they had. It was a real gift that he had of being able to recognize this player is way more than what the recruiting stars would say. Or he would look at somebody and where others might see a linebacker, he would see 2 years in the weight room and see them as a starting offensive tackle who actually could move their feet. Right. And so he just had a real skill for that. And then he had a skill for finding guys. I don't know how he did it. He would find an Izell Reese who probably should have been at a much higher level, or find a Kevin Drake who definitely should have been, more highly recruited than he was, or find a Don Blackman or a Cedric Buchanan. Cedric Buchanan could have played anywhere. Derek Ingram could have played anywhere. Derek Ingram could have, if he'd have been at an SEC school, could have been all SEC. And yet somehow he was playing Division III football at UAB. And that was Jim Hillier. That was Jim Hillier and his staff beating the bushes and finding players. And they were good at it.
So not only did you work for the school paper and did photography for the SID office, but you also got the distinct honor of working with a legend in sports in the state of Alabama. From 1993 to 1995, you got to be the color commentator for the UAB football program alongside Gary Sanders. So what was that like?
Oh, Gary was tremendous. I had no business being in the booth with him. Gary was one of the best broadcasts in the country. Gary was, UAB was incredibly blessed to have Gary Sanders. This is a guy who, in March when UAB wasn't playing, was calling games for CBS. Okay. He was big time. And a little story about how that happened. Coach Bartow, one of the things he always did is he would turn to me as a student and say, we need to get more students involved. And he would ask me for ideas. Right. So during basketball, for example, I created a group called the Bartow Bleacher Creatures and went and got a member of Kaleidoscope, who was the cartoonist, to draw the actual logo for it. And, we were the Bartow Bleacher Creatures. I'll tell you a story about that in a minute. To get students involved, it was basically the precursor to the Gang Green or whatever they're called today, right?
Yeah.
But Coach said, why don't we, what do you have any ideas to get students involved with football? This was the year UAB was moving to 1AA. And I said, well, why don't we do a student contest to be the color analyst? Right? That was my idea. So we did that. And we had people, both students and people in the community, who were selected to be guest color analysts. And I had to audition for it just like anybody else, but Gary picked me to be one of them. And a few other people that I remember. One of the ones selected was Charlie Boswell, who was blind. He was the very famous Alabama blind golfer, right? So we had a blind man do the color commentary. He was actually pretty good. For not being able to see the game, he added some good insight. But I was one of those. So in 1993, I did UAB's game at Western Kentucky, and I can't remember the other one. But then the next year, I became the full-time analyst, and I did that in 1994 and 1995 seasons. And probably would have continued, except it became a conflict of interest when I was hired at the Post Herald, and they didn't want me to be part of the broadcast team. So that was understandable, but it was a lot of fun, and really got to see the program from a different angle, and got to work alongside a truly legendary play-by-play man who was incredibly gracious to me in helping me learn the ropes, and look good, and not sound incredibly stupid or unqualified. It was great.
So I know there were two games that you wanted to talk about specifically while you were color commentator. The first was UAB's first game against a 1A opponent on the road at Kansas, kind of a bleak game. And the other was UAB's first win over a 1A level team, which was North Texas on the road in 1995. What can you recall from those games?
Oh, wow, that Kansas game. All right, first off, let me say this. I have never seen a team play so well and lose 72-0. It was really pretty incredible to watch, where UAB's team at that time transitioning into 1AA and was still not even at full 1AA scholarship. A vast majority of UAB starters on that 1994 team had come there on partial scholarships or even as Division III players. So we go to Kansas, and I'll never forget, we pull in and we go to the practice walkthrough the day before the game, and the UAB players are in there working out, and it just so happened that the Kansas players happened to walk past, and a few of them stuck their head in the locker room. I mean, not in the locker room, but in the practice area where we were. And you could just see the looks on their faces of, oh my goodness, this is who we're playing. We're going to kill this team, right? But just because they were massive, right? They were a Big 8 team. And not only at that time was Kansas a Big 8 team, but they were a good one. They had Glenn Mason. They were in the top 25 several times under Glenn Mason. They were regularly winning 7, 8, 9 ball games. And so they were not the Kansas that we see today. They were good. And I remember going out there, and it was only 24-0 in the first half, which obviously is still a pretty large lead. But UAB had driven deep in Kansas territory twice and had mistakes. And another time, there were a couple of times where they had gotten stops, but got a penalty on a third down and extended a drive that ended up being a touchdown drive when they had really forced a punt, if not for an offsides or something, right? So they were physically pretty competitive, and Derek Ingram was giving them fits. Derek Ingram was getting open. John Whitcomb was getting the ball. And the other thing that I can remember is that was the day that I knew that Josh Evans was going to make the NFL, because Kansas had an all Big 12 guard, and Josh ate his breakfast, lunch, and dinner the entire day. I mean, he lived in that backfield. And that's when I kind of knew that I don't care what the draft says or anything like that. Josh Evans is going to make the NFL, and he's going to make some people regret they didn't pick him. That just was an example, but, obviously it got away from them pretty badly in the second half. I think it's one of those situations when there's such a talent difference, right, that every mistake becomes 6, right? It's one of those kind of situations. Every missed tackle turns into 6.
Yeah.
Every time you punt it and you don't make the first tackle turns into 6. Every time you have a penalty, wipe out a good play, it's going to be followed by a bad play. I mean, it's just one of those things, right? But they played really well. And then, of course, in 1995, they go to North Texas. It was one of those situations where they were expected to get crushed, but Kevin Drake and Cedric Buchanan and Robert Leslie and a bunch of those guys had other ideas.
So in 1995, UAB saw the coaching change in football from Dr. Hillier to Watson Brown. What was he like with you, and what are some of your best memories with him?
Oh, so, that 1994 season, everybody kind of knew that was going to be a transition year as the year went on, right? And it had that real feel about it that UAB football was going to be transitioning into a new era. The announcement for 1A had been made. They were going to be moving to Division 1A in 1996. And you had this big class of original Blazers, your Josh Evanses and your John Whitcombs and Cedric Buchanan's, Derek Ingrams, Mike Trammell's, Mark McClooney's. I could go on and on with those people from that era who were what I call the OG Blazers, right? They were all in there last year, and everybody just kind of knew as that year went on, there was probably going to be a change. That's why when they went to Prairie View in that last game, and I think you referenced this game on John Whitcomb's podcast where John lit up Prairie View that day, and that we were seeing the end of that era. And in fact, I had heard Watson Brown's name all the way back at the beginning of that year, that if there was a change, Watson Brown could end up being the coach. Now, by the time all this was going down, I was working at the Post-Herald as a freelancer, and I actually wrote some of the news stories about the coaching search. And so, there were a lot of names being mentioned, but they came back to Watson, and Watson came on. And I remember at the time there were a lot of Blazer fans who were, what are we doing? Watson Brown has a losing record. What are we doing hiring Watson Brown? But for what needed to happen for UAB right there, I thought Coach Brown was a great fit. He had been in tough jobs. He understood how to build a program and compete without having the silver spoon, right? Of being at a resource deficit. He was very likable and could work out in the community. And as we saw a few years later, when UAB needed to raise some money and Watson had to put on the athletic director's hat, Watson Brown could work town. I mean, likable guy. He could raise money. He could get people involved. And, he made a pretty smooth transition. And in 95, you could even see it, even though they took some tough losses early in that season transitioning. By the end of the year, they were pretty good, 1AA team. And they went to North Texas and beat a 1A team. And, they closed with some nice W's that built them some momentum moving into 96. And really what I would say from 96 up until the Darrell Hackney years, UAB was a pretty credible program. They were overachieving in a lot of ways and getting good players in there and building a program and doing it the right way without a lot of things that they really needed. And, I kind of look at UAB football history as there was kind of the pre-Black Friday UAB football when the board kind of said make money or else. And then there was UAB football after that where Watson was doing double jobs and it became a little harder to recruit because of that cloud. And things began to unravel. But up until that point, I thought Watson Brown did a great job. His staff did a great job. And UAB was, for a period, only Southern Miss won more Conference USA games than UAB over a 5-year period there when UAB came into the league. And that's pretty incredible for a startup team to do that.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you came to UAB during a very dynamic time. The launch of the football program, moved to 1A, going on to the Great Midwestern Conference USA, and also being in there from, you mentioned meeting Gene Bartow and seeing him coach, and then the transition to Murray Bartow. What were some of the things that you saw behind the scenes from that era that maybe the general Blazer public might not have seen and that you can share with us?
Oh, yeah. So, one, Coach Bartow was an intense competitor. And he was also incredibly superstitious. I didn't know that, right? But he was incredibly superstitious, and they were moving into the Great Midwest, where you had programs like Marquette, DePaul, Cincinnati, Memphis. I mean, these were tough programs. These were programs that were used to winning, that were very tradition rich in basketball, and UAB was moving up a level. And right away, Coach Bartow's teams were very competitive. Guys like Elbert Rogers were, sliding right in there and being all conference players. Guys like Stanley Jackson. But you could also see that the brilliance of Coach Bartow, because while UAB was a good Sun Belt team, and I think would have been contending for the Sun Belt championship, this was a definite step up, right? And you were playing deeper teams with higher levels of talent. And Coach Bartow had to figure out how to compete. So there was a period there where he went with kind of the slow down style, where they were slowing the game down and playing defense. And guys like George Wilkerson and Frank Hayward were locking up on people and making life miserable for guys that would go on and play in the NBA, And I'll never forget, I got picked to go on a road trip. Joe Davidson, who was associate AD at the time, said, now, if we win this game, you'll probably get to come back, because coach is superstitious like that. He's going to want you to sit in the same seat on the bus, and he's going to want you to sit in the same spot on the bench. So they go up there as a road trip. We're going to go to Marquette and then DePaul. And they go up there to Marquette, and that was a really good Marquette team coached by Kevin O'Neill. They had a guy who played in the NBA, big 7'2" center named Jim McElvain, and a couple of other really good players, Andre Miller, a couple other guys. And Coach Bartow slowed the game down. And Stamp Jackson had a great game, and I think UAB won like 47-45. Marquette was in the top 25. UAB beat them. And they're like, well, Tim, you got it made. You go. So we go to DePaul. I think UAB got up 17 on DePaul, and I'm sitting there on the bench, and I'm thinking, I got it made. I'm gonna get to go next road trip too. And then I think last 10 minutes of the game, DePaul just blasted them. Ended up winning, going away. UAB went completely cold, and they had a big 6'10" center who ate their lunch there in the last 10 minutes. And there was the end of my road trips. But I never got to go on another one. But got to see really from that period of 91 to 92, 93, 94. That was Coach Bartow as good as he'd ever been. And it didn't show fully in the record. There wasn't a run to the Final Eight, although I think there was a team good enough to do it if they'd gotten a better draw. But they were playing such a step up in class night in and night out. And, getting in the top 25 and beating Cincinnati multiple times when Cincinnati would have a Nick Van Exel and a Corey Blunt and, prep All-Americans, or beating a Memphis when they had Penny Hardaway, or, beating Marquette and Dwayne, that wasn't Dwayne Wade, that was later Coach Anderson. But, that was Coach Bartow, like, right. And you have to understand something else about Coach Bartow. He was full of humility always. But that man liked the big stage now. All right. And he had taken UAB to it, and he desperately wanted to get back. And he liked competing against those big time coaches and those big time programs, because he always believed UAB was going to be a big time program, and he was going to do what it took to make that happen. And that included football. And that's a big part of his legacy, what we're going to see out in Protective this fall. That goes back to Gene Bartow and his vision.
So, yeah, I've had a lot of great players on the podcast. Some of them are from that era. Some of them you've mentioned: Cedric Buchanan, John Whitcomb, Stanley Jackson, Frank Haywood. You probably got to know a lot of these players personally back then. So who were some of your favorite players from that era?
Oh, I loved all those guys. And of course, I was their hookup for photos, right? I was a team photographer, so I was popular. they would always, hey, Tim, did you get my touchdown? Hey, you're going to quote me in the paper, or, whatever, right? So, yeah, not only being around the team, but, lived in the dorms with those guys. George Wilkerson lived on my floor across the hall, so you spend a lot of time around them, obviously around practice and everything. So, there was so many. And the thing that I remember, if you look at it now, not only were there good football players and good basketball players, good tennis players and all those things, but they were good people who've gone on to be very successful in life in whatever they ultimately chose to do. And some of them made it all the way to the NFL, like an Izell Reese or a Danon Sidney or Josh Evans. Others, played arena ball like Cedric. Others became successful businessmen or teachers or coaches, or, running for governor like Walt Maddox, who's, been the long successful mayor in Tuscaloosa and ran for governor last time, or, they're doctors like Alan Willis, right? So, there were people there who truly cared about each other. It was an incredibly vibrant time. And I think everybody who was there and part of it knew that they were part of a special time. They knew they were part of something bigger themselves, and it's why they came there. And it's why they come back today. When you go out to Protective Stadium, I guarantee when you're walking around there, you're going to see a lot of former players. You're going to see a lot of former players, not just from football. You're going to see people who come back to be part of it because they put in the sweat equity that got us to there. And there's just, I can't fully describe, I don't think, the energy that was taking place, but everybody was riding it, and they definitely could feel that they were part of it.
So after you left UAB, like you mentioned, you went to the Birmingham Post Herald. You also went to the Orlando Sentinel, South Florida Sun Sentinel, deputy managing editor for CBS Sports. You were an original member of the Jocks Roundtable that is still going on today, and you were part of the Feinbaum Show. What would you say have been the most valuable lessons that you've learned from these experiences?
Oh, that's a great question. And certainly, I had a long, fun career in sports journalism, but that time at UAB definitely informed that. Being on the inside of a college athletic department during a period of, dynamic change and conference moves and the politics involved around Division I athletics, and seeing that from the inside, and seeing the way Coach Bartow handled that and the expectations that he set for his staff around it. That informed the way we covered things, right? That informed the way we covered things. And I was in markets that happened to be, around Conference USA, like Orlando, where Central Florida was, and a very similar university, UAB. And I think that experience of having been on the other side of it really did shape the way we covered things. And I had a general philosophy in sports that, if you were the beat writer covering Central Florida or Miami Hurricanes or Miami Dolphins or whatever it was, you didn't work for me. You didn't work for the Orlando Sentinel or the Birmingham Post-Herald. You worked for the fans who cared about that team. That's really who you were working for. And that was a little bit of thinking that was a little bit of ahead of its time. But we were really looking at it from a digital side, right? And how, to me, if we were doing a good job of covering our teams, we were leveraging the access that we had to get the answers that the people who cared about that program wanted. And we were to anticipate them, which means we needed to know them. We needed to understand what would be important to them so we could ask the right questions, right? And we reached a point in covering those teams where you could cover those teams very fairly, aggressively, and even cover the really hard stories and ask the uncomfortable questions. But to that fan base, it wouldn't be true until you reported it, because they trusted you, right? And they knew that you weren't going to come at them with cheap shots. You weren't going to come at them with, things that were unfair. You were going to cover the team fairly, and you were going to cover them objectively, but do it from an angle of understanding what would be important to them. And I felt like that's how we were to be successful online in an age of social media, where fans could go connect directly to the teams. They could go connect directly to the athletes. And we needed to be part of that by being the access that they couldn't have.
One of the key things that we've kind of alluded to in the last few questions and everything has been, you left UAB in 1995, but you didn't actually graduate from UAB until 2015. So tell us about that and what it meant to finally get that degree from UAB.
All right. So I love to joke that I turned pro early. I gave up my scholarship at UAB to go write stories for $25 a story to Birmingham Post-Herald. I really wanted to be a sports writer or a sports editor. And in retrospect, there are many times that I second guessed myself. Coach Bartow, he envisioned me being an athletic director or something. That was sort of his plan for me. And, he had actually even talked about, hey, you can go here and then you could go up to the conference office and work for Mike's Live, or, a lot of these different things. And, journalism was in my blood, and I felt that's where I needed to be. So I went to the Post-Herald and eventually worked my way all the way up to sports editor, and then moved on to other places. It was exciting to be part of that. And I never needed my degree. The plan was always I was going to go back, but, the life of a sports writer, as you can imagine, isn't really conducive to 8 a.m. classes and, doing all these things, right? And then life happens. You get married and have kids. And it just kind of fell by the wayside, Bill. And then when Coach Bartow passed away in 2012, I could just hear him in my head, right? And I could just hear his voice. Lord, Tim, you need to go back and get that degree. I know you don't need it, Mr. Big Time Sports Writer, but you'll be glad you did. And every time he would see me, he would say something about it. And after he passed away, I just felt guilt. And so I called up to UAB just out of luck. Actually, before I did it, I was in South Florida at the time. I went over to, check at Florida Atlantic, Florida International, and some of the schools down there. And it was going to be ridiculously expensive, and I was basically going to have to start over. So that was kind of a non-starter. And somebody said to me, you really should just call up there to UAB, Tim. They already count you as an alumni. You should probably just, see if there's a way. And so I called, and I'll never forget it. I called Andy Marsh. Andy was by this time a senior vice president at UAB. I knew Andy as the director of student life, that I was part of the committee that made me editor of Kaleidoscope back in 1994. Right. So I called Andy and he said, "Are you serious?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm serious." And he goes, well, go online and fill out this form, pay you $25, and I'll get back to you. And I think within maybe 36 or 48 hours, I was enrolled, and I was taking online classes, and, in between running cbssports.com and, all those other things, at 3 a.m. I was doing freshman algebra.
Wow.
And going back and taking, I had 6 classes left. So I finished those online and actually did really valuable work for my career in doing so. I did a couple of thesis level type studies around media and media education that I was using at that time as president of the Associated Press Sports Editors. That's the largest sports journalism organization. I was president of that organization, and I was using all that research to help us provide some valuable data for hiring managers, and also to shape how we would create student chapters to support student journalism, of which UAB was one of the first chapters that happened. But, on April, I think it was April 20, I don't remember, April 15th, April 24th. I don't remember the date right now. My mind's blanking, but 2015 in April, I walked commencement, and CJ Washington from the basketball team was a couple people behind me. I'll never forget that. But I don't think I've ever had a prouder day other than the day I became a dad, because that was keeping a promise to Gene Bartow. And in fact, the very first thing that I did after I passed commencement and went on through and we threw the things in the air and celebrated, I went straight to Coach Bartow's statue in Bartow Arena and took a picture. And I thanked that man, because Coach Bartow saw something in me and believed in me and was willing to take a chance on me, this kid from Fort Payne, Alabama. And yeah, he might have probably rather got my roommate, but I think in the big scheme of things, he was glad he got me. And I just couldn't thank him enough. And I mean, I cried like a baby up there at that statue, because he believed in me. And it was the legacy of Coach Bartow. I promise you could interview 1,000 former employees and players of Coach Bartow, or football players who worked around Coach Bartow. People like Justin Kraft, who, I was one of the first people when Justin transferred from Georgia Tech. I was one of the first people to meet him. We became friends to this day. But when football was shut down and people rose up to protest that and bring that football program back, as much as people respect and love Bill Clark, a lot of those people were fighting for Gene Bartow, because football was Gene Bartow's baby. It was his legacy. He was the one who understood that a football program at a university like UAB, a comprehensive elite urban institution, should have a football program, would need a football program in the coming landscape to be competitive in all sports. And his whole thing was, if it's good for Memphis and it's good for UCLA and it's good for Houston, why can't it be good for UAB? And I heard him say that so many times. And when football went away, all of us who were part of Gene Bartow's legacy, we're his legacy. We said, no, this shall not stand. And this will not happen without our say. And, whether that was successful or not, those people stood up and were heard. And enough of them stood up and were heard that it created momentum and got the right attention and got things going the right way. And I think if Coach Bartow today were alive to see what is happening, he would be beaming like the proudest papa who ever lived.
Extremely well said. Extremely well said.
He would be beaming like the biggest papa who ever lived, because what you're going to see in Protective Stadium was his vision for UAB. It was his dream for UAB that would happen.
100%. Extremely well said. You were giving me chills just then. That's awesome. One man that was definitely a huge part in the return. You wrote a book about him and with him. You moved back to Birmingham in 2017. You wrote the book about Tim Alexander. The book, Ever Faithful, Ever Loyal, the Timothy Alexander story, has been a popular read among Blazer fans in the Birmingham community. What was it like working with Tim and hearing his story?
Oh, Tim Alexander he's the most inspirational person I've ever met in my life. He is the most positive person that I've ever met in my life. he is someone who, no matter what the situation is, Tim is going to see the bright and the light in it. And he's going to reach out to those things. He's going to pull it out of people. I see him do it all the time when he's out speaking, right? And Tim reached out to me. And by that, I mean, Tim didn't actually reach out to me. I mean, his story reached out to me. I was living in South Florida when the football program was shut down, and I kept seeing this guy on all of the YouTube clips, right? This guy in the wheelchair. And, we had actually done a story on Timothy in 2013 at CBS Sports. I happened to see one that was done by the local CBS affiliate, Lauren Sisler, here in Birmingham, Alabama, Channel 42. Part of my job at CBS was to go through all that affiliate stuff and see if there was a story worthy of national attention that we would then assign. And we did a story on Timothy and his impact on UAB football and Garrett McGee's last season, the year he got put on scholarship. So I knew who he was. And then I see him doing all of this stuff during the fight to bring back football. And I could see his passion, right? I could see what made Tim special through just those snippets of 30 seconds here or there. So I reached out to him, and the company I was with at the time, Sports Manias, I actually hired him as an intern. So I knew Tim, knew of him. We had come up here to the Conference USA Basketball Championships and done an event up here. And Tim was part of that, did some marketing for us. So I knew him. But as his story was unfolding and as the fight to save football was won, and as I got to know Tim a little bit, I just reached out to him and I told him, hey, it's been on my heart that I feel like I was meant to write a book, and yours is the story that I was born to tell. And he was like, I was thinking the same thing. It's been on my heart to write a book, and who better to write it than somebody who's at CBS Sports, who's also a Blazer, who knows the story. And so that's how that conversation started. And so, I interviewed Tim over and over and over and began interviewing and telling the whole story. But I'll tell you this about it, Will. I hit a period of writer's block. I don't know if you've ever experienced that or not. I know you've spent some time in journalism too, but I don't know if I was rusty or what, but I hit a period of writer's block, and I was just kind of shutting down. And this was late 17, I think it was right around Christmas. And I was behind schedule. The book wasn't going well. The words weren't coming out. And Tim and I had a conversation. He sat down and we did this over the phone. We had a long conversation. He prayed, and I don't know what it was, but after he and I had that conversation, it was like the weight of the world was lifted off my shoulders. Over the next roughly 48 hours, I wrote that entire book. All right. Seriously. I threw away everything that I'd done, and I just started writing, and the words just started flowing off my fingertips. And I did the entire book in about 48 hours. Now, of course, we did edits and rewrites and those kind of things that are part of the process of writing a book. But, every couple of hours I'd send a new chapter, and it was there, and it just kind of flowed. And of course it was I'm really proud of it. It hit #1 on Amazon in 3 categories, bestseller in 3 categories. And, we've had some success with it. And since that time, I've turned it into a screenplay, and hopefully someday it'll be a movie. It certainly should be a movie. And I can't think of a better ambassador for UAB and to be the physical representation of the return than Timothy Alexander. He is a first-class human being through and through, who touches everybody who comes in contact with them. And, I couldn't be more proud to call him friend.
So I ask it for all my other guests. How is life now?
Oh, it's great. I'm here in Birmingham, although there's a possibility I'm moving to Florida here pretty soon, but I'll still come back for football games. But I'm here in Birmingham working for a company called Influencer. We work in the space of name, image, and likeness, which is a big deal in college athletics right now. And yeah. I've been with Influencer since early 2018, doing business development, sales, and marketing for Influencer. And we've grown from 4 logos when I first joined the company, UAB being one of the early clients, to now more than 180 schools that we work with. And, with name, image, and likeness being a reality now in college athletics, we're there to help student athletes build their brands and take advantage of and make the most of their opportunities, while also helping the institutions grow their own program reach and monitor all of this in a way that's compliant with rules and laws, and provide student athletes with education on best practices and what they can and should do and should not do to be compliant with the rules. So it's been a journey and a lot of fun. It's been a transition, but it's been great. And of course, it's been great to be here in Birmingham, where, reconnected with so many people, and also to, be part of UAB. I'm on the alumni board for the College of Arts and Sciences, which is pretty cool. It's very dynamic what's happening now at the university. And of course, staying in touch with a lot of my old colleagues from Kaleidoscope, including yourself. There's one of the things that's interesting, Will, there's a lot of talent come through that place. People don't realize UAB isn't known as a journalism school, right? That's Missouri and Columbia and Northwestern, those places. But I can tell you something that Missouri and Columbia and Northwestern can't claim, which is UAB has 2 former presidents of the Associated Press sports editors, not 1, 2.
Wow.
Myself and somebody who followed me later at Kaleidoscope, John Bednarowski, was also president of that organization. And we've had great people like Joe Goodman, who's here in town now, who's an alumnus, obviously. And my old Kaleidoscope buddy, Marcus Nelson, is down there at CBS Sports now, and many, many others I'm hesitant to start naming because I'll leave somebody off who's great, better than all of us. But, there's been a lot of talent go through UAB, and to have gone away and come back home to Birmingham and to see the dynamic growth, to see the transformation of downtown and the transformation and excitement of the campus, and to see the way that something so horrible, the death of a football program, rallied everybody together centered on making this place better. And that was making UAB better, making Birmingham better, all of those things. And to see it now all in place, where the university is touching people in so many ways, and our alumni are touching people and helping people in so many ways. And it's now all crystallized with the best yet to come.
Exactly. Extremely well said, Tim. I've thoroughly enjoyed this episode so far. And I've got a couple more questions for you before we go. I got 2 social media questions for you, and then a lighthearted lightning round to keep you on your toes. The first is from my last guest on the last episode, Mr. John Whitcomb, former UAB football quarterback from that same area when you were there. He asked, who taught you how to ball, and do you still play?
He's referencing my basketball skills, which are not actually very good, but for an old guy, I still can shoot a little bit. As I like to say, I still have the jumper, just not the jump. I lost the jump in about 1992. But no, John and I used to play pickup games. I'm surprised he remembered that. And we had a lot of fun back in the day. I'm the son of a basketball coach, and I'm a gym rat. I grew up in the gym, and, I had illusions that I might play college basketball and quickly figured out my path and was going to be to write about it, not play it. But yeah, I grew up shooting ball, and I still do. I up until the pandemic, I was still running hoops down in the UAB rec, playing against guys like, Bronte Harris and Shaq Jones. I got maxed up having to guard Shaq one day, which let me tell you, wasn't a lot of fun for me, but it'll be a memory someday, right? But yeah, I still run hoops when I can. And let me just say this, okay? Well, when they call you Pops, that's your nickname. That's when you've crossed over into the old guys. Be wary of them guys they call Pops, and especially be wary of the old guy who brings his own ball. That guy can actually play. And no, he can't get up and down the floor. No, he ain't going to guard anybody. But if you leave him open, you're probably going to have some problems. So that's me.
And the second question is from David Pettit. He asks, growing up in the state, how did you answer the inevitable question, who did you root for?
Oh, that's a great question, right? So I was born in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. My father went to the University of Alabama, so I was born there while he was wrapping up his college degree. So I grew up a Bama fan like a lot of people did. And then I had my period in high school when there was this guy running around the plains named Bo Jackson. right? So I kind of became an Auburn fan for a brief little period there, and actually met Bo when I was at Auburn for a camp. And I just happened to be walking down the street, and here's Bo Jackson walking between class and the Auburn football complex. And I immediately looked at him and saw that his thighs were bigger than my waist. Bo Jackson was some kind of specimen, right? And so he was just an incredible athlete. So period. But, you know, once I gravitated toward a media career, you kind of quickly put that kind of fandom stuff aside. And, you know, people would always ask me, were you a Bama fan? Were you an Auburn fan? UAB, whatever. I said, no, when I was in journalism, I was for all of our teams because it was good for business when the teams we covered were good, because fans wanted to read about them, right? You know, when the teams were struggling, they cut off the social media. They didn't want to read about, you know, their team losing. So, you know, I was for the teams to do well. And mostly I was rooting for good deadlines and interesting storylines, you know, because that was what you're rooting for. But, you know, when I moved back to Birmingham and I got out of the media biz, was doing other things, I also got to experience something that I'd never got to do in my life. And that was go to games, tailgate, be a normal person, right? And, you know, go enjoy. And I did. I have thoroughly enjoyed being here in Birmingham and, you know, being around programs. And of course, now I'm still working in college athletics again in a tangential way. You know, I'm back to that. I root for them all. I want them all to succeed. I want the athletes to be successful. It's always great to see people striving and achieving. And no matter where you are, you can root for excellence, right? And I like to see excellence. But yeah, that's how I always answered it. You know, when I was in the sports biz, I was rooting for good deadlines and interesting storylines.
And I've got a lighthearted lightning round here for you. I got 5 questions, and I want you to first answer that comes to your mind. Don't think about it. Just answer. Just go ahead and go. You ready?
Sure.
All right, here we go. Number 1, milk before cereal or cereal before milk?
Oh, I don't need the milk. Just give me the cereal, man. Give me some peanut butter crunch and let's go.
What's the largest animal that you think you could beat with your bare hands?
An elephant.
Ooh, really? It's a bit you're boastful there, Tim. Jeez.
Roll Tide.
Number 3, would you rather time travel to the past or to the future?
Oh, I would love to go to the future.
Okay. I not what you would typically expect, but okay.
I would love to go to the future because I would go get me that sports book. I would know the winner of every game between now and 2032.
Number 4, what's your favorite color?
Green.
Okay. And number 5, you can add one former UAB football player to the current roster. Who would it be?
Oh, wow. Do I need to go with overall talent or need?
Whatever you feel.
On their roster right now, you know, there's so many that I could pick, but I have to tell you, just because I would love to see him play at this level, how good he could truly be going against higher level competition each and every week. I'd love to see Josh Evans on this team. Rest in peace, Josh, because that guy was a warrior, man. And I just have to think if he had the opportunity to have competed against talent comparable to him day in and day out, he might have been a 10-year all-pro as opposed to just a 10-year pro.
That's a fantastic answer and fantastic answers. I loved this conversation so much, Tim. It was awesome to get and hear your stories from the writing aspect of it, photography and everything. Thank you for being such a huge part of UAB history and a big part of the Birmingham community as well. And thank you again for your time, and thank you for all you've contributed. Thanks for being on the episode.
Great to see you and talk to you, and appreciate Blazer Nation. I love what you're doing with this podcast. I've listened to all of them, and it's always great to hear from, you know, particularly people from my era that, you know, maybe I've lost track of or don't get to talk to as often as I'd like. So keep up the great work.
Thank you very much. Go Blazers. All right. I want to thank Tim for stopping by the Dragon's Den and sharing some awesome memories. It's crazy how one interaction can have such a huge impact on your life. Tim meeting Gene Bartow and Coach Bartow's kindness and eye for talent helped Tim get to where he is today. A fantastic episode. Thanks again, Tim. Before I go, I've got birthday shout outs and UAB football games played from August 21st through September 3rd in the This Week in Blazer History segment, all gathered by Steve Rutherford, big Blazer fan, at Memphis Blazer on Twitter. We're picking up where we left off, like I said, from August 21st through September 3rd. No games or birthdays on August 21st, so August 22nd, born in 1992, Chad Frazier, a solid guard that played for the men's basketball team for one season from 2013 to 2014. Born in 1987, former UAB football defensive back Elliot McGaskin. August 23rd, born in 1976, Rod Willie, a former guard for the men's basketball team in the 90s. Born in 1994, recent UAB quarterback AJ Erdley. Also, congrats to AJ on his new position as the offensive coordinator and QB's coach at Northeast Mississippi Community College. Celebrating his 30th birthday, former UAB football guard and current offensive tackle for the Cleveland Browns, Mr. Chris Hubbard. Happy birthday, Chris. August 24th, born in 1994, Dirk Williams. Many of us remember Dirk, an extremely talented guard for the Blazers for two seasons from 2015 to 2017. Happy birthday, Dirk. Born in 1989, former UAB softball player Kayla Orr, a solid player for the program from 2008 to 2012. August 25th, born in 1989, Pharaoh Ali Hadzik, former center for the men's basketball team from 2012 to 2014. August 26th, born in 1984, former UAB football safety Brandon Register, and born in 2002, current UAB men's soccer forward Tyrell Price. August 27th has a couple of birthdays. In 1962, Scott McCabe was born, former forward for the men's basketball team in the early 80s. And in 2001, current UAB junior defensive back Keandre Swoops was born. Happy birthday, Keandre and Scott. August 28th, born in 1972, Reginald Allen, forward for the men's basketball team in the mid-90s. Celebrating his 20th birthday, born in 2001, current UAB football kicker Reese Burkhart. Also born on August 28th, current UAB women's volleyball player Grace Coper. Happy birthday, Grace. Also on August 28th, we get our first game played on the calendar year, UAB at Kansas in 1997. The Blazers lost 24-0. Some August 29th birthdays. Former UAB football running back Dan Burks, one of my all-time favorites. He was born on August 29th, 1983. Another football player celebrates his birthday on August 29th. Former UAB football defensive lineman Jermaine McKelveen. He was born in 1984. Another game played on August 29th. This one was just a couple of years ago. Alabama State at UAB in 2019. The Blazers won 24-19. August 30th, we've got a few good birthdays here. Born in 1986, Paul Delaney, one of my all-time favorite guards in my lifetime. Paul was a great player on the men's basketball team from 2004 to 2009 and is number 11 on the scoring list in school history. Born in 1998, Nate Darling. Nate played guard for the men's basketball team from 2016 to 2018 before transferring to Delaware. He is now a player for the Greensboro Swarm, the G League team for the Charlotte Hornets. Also August 30th, former UAB football great Rodriguez Brooks, a legend many Blazer fans remember from his outstanding performance against ranked East Carolina in 1999. Also some games played on the gridiron from August 30th. We have 5 in total. The first one happened in 2001. Against Montana State, the Blazers throttled the Bobcats 41-13. The second from August 30th, UAB at Baylor in 2003. The Blazers won 24-19. In 2008, the Blazers weren't so lucky in a home game against Tulsa where the Blazers lost 45-22. In 2014, the Blazers gave a big beatdown to in-state rival Troy in a 48-10 win. And the last one came in 2018 against Savannah State in a 52-0 blowout over the Tigers. The Blazers are 4-1 on August 30th. August 31st, born in 1988, Bias Hamga, a former UAB basketball center from 2010 to 2012 after transferring from UNLV. On August 31st, we had 3 games played, and the Blazers didn't do so hot on this date. In 1996, the Blazers played at Auburn in the first 1A game. The Blazers lost 29-0. In 2002, the Blazers played at Florida, lost 51-3. And in 2013, the Blazers played at Troy and lost in a 34-31 overtime heartbreaker. September 1st, we have 3 birthdays. Born in 1960, the late Donnie Spear, one of the UAB men's basketball greats. Spear played center for the Blazers from 1978 to 1982. Born in 1961, Cliff Pruitt. Pruitt was a transfer from UCLA who played forward for the Blazers in the early 80s. Born in 1990, recent UAB football defensive lineman Anthony Rush. Anthony has played a few seasons in the NFL and is currently with the Tennessee Titans. 2 games played on September 1st all time, both sadly losses again. 2007 at Michigan State, the Blazers lost 55-18, and in 2012, in a game against Troy, the Blazers lost 39-29. September 2nd, couple of good birthdays here. Born in 1971, Carter Long, a sharp shooting guard for the men's basketball team from 1990 to 1994. Happy birthday, Carter. Born in 1996, Anderson McCoy. Anderson was a recent guard on the men's basketball team after transferring from junior college and played for the Blazers from 2017 to 2019. There's 4 games played all time for the Blazers on September 2nd. In 1995, UAB played Alabama State, lost 13-3. In 2006, the Blazers played at top 10 ranked Oklahoma and lost 24-17 in a game that came down to a blown call that I could spend hours talking about. In 2010, the Blazers played Florida Atlantic at home and lost in a 32-31 heartbreaker. And the most recent one, the return game, many of us remember in 2017, the game against Alabama A&M. The Blazers won 38-7. And our final day, September 3rd, born in 2001, current UAB softball infielder Brooke Davis. Happy birthday, Brooke. And 2 current UAB football players share birthdays on September 3rd, tight end Mike Crawford and offensive lineman Trey Badowski. 3 games played on September 3rd all time. 1994, UAB at Alabama State, a heartbreaking loss 27-24. In 2005, another nail-biting game that came down to the end, a loss to number 2 ranked Tennessee at Neyland Stadium 17-10. And the most recent one came last year against Central Arkansas in the opening game. The Blazers won 45-35. And that's going to do it for this week in Blazer history and episode 26 of the Dragon's Den. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope to see many of you down in Montgomery this upcoming Wednesday in the first game of the football season, as we hope to put a beat down on Jacksonville State. If you do go, safe travels. If not, be sure to tune in and cheer hard for our Blazers. Be sure to follow my social pages at Dragon's Den EFEL on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. See you next time. Good night, and go Blazers.